Glenn looks at his depth, 60 meters. He checks his cylinder pressure and realizes he's short on air. Everyone started the dive with the same amount of air. He decides they've gone far enough and it's time to head back. He signals to ascend, but the group swims on, heading deeper into the cave. South Australia's limestone coast has over 50 water-filled sinkholes and more than 800 caves. One of these sinkholes is known as the Shaft, a world-class dive destination located in a field known as Thompson's Paddock near Allendale East, a few kilometers south of Mount Gambier. The Shaft was discovered in 1938 when a farmer's horse stumbled over a hole less than 30 centimeters in diameter. When the farmer investigated, he found the hole opened into a deep sinkhole filled with water. To avoid an accident, he poured rubble into the hole, hoping to fill and cover it. After dumping more than a ton of rocks over a period of time, he realized the hole was deeper and larger than he imagined. In the 60s, cavers enlarged the hole to 1 meter so they could climb into the porous limestone chamber. 7 meters below ground level, the chamber opens up to a 17-meter wide lake. The Shaft became a popular cave diving site in the early 1970s. By 1973, the Shaft accumulated over 8,000 dives. Descending into the lake, the main chamber is 140 meters long and 80 meters wide. The rock pile the farmer dumped litters the floor of the main chamber from 40 meters, rising up to a depth of 36 meters. Recreational diving has a few different limits on time and depth. The bottom of this main chamber at 40 meters is the depth limit for recreational divers. A diver can spend 9 minutes at 40 meters before they need to head back up to the surface. If they stay longer than that, they need to start making decompression stops on the way up, which takes a lot more planning and more tanks of air. If they don't do these decompression stops, then they could get decompression sickness. And when a diver has normal air in their tank, like the air we breathe at the surface, then the absolute depth limit is 66 meters. Deeper than that, and the oxygen levels in your blood will become toxic, leading to convulsions and eventually death. So the main chamber in the Shaft is really the limit for most divers. Not to mention that cave diving really needs special training and equipment. Beyond the rock pile are 2 tunnels, one extending to the northwest and another to the east. The entrance to the tunnels are referred to as the drop-off or the edge. No natural light from the Shaft reaches into these pitch black tunnels. Because of the size of the hole and the height of the drop, divers and their equipment are lowered into the water using a rope ladder and a hoist system. The Shaft gets its name from the sunlight shining through the small opening at the surface, lighting the underwater cavern and the enormous boulders more than 60 meters below the waterline. On the 26th of May 1973, a group of 9 young divers aged 22 to 28 from the South Pacific Diving Club of New South Wales make a trip to Mount Gambier. They set up tents at the Queen Elizabeth Caravan Park opposite an ancient volcanic crater called the Blue Lake. The next day, on the 27th, the group heads south to the Thompson's Paddock property. They meet B.V. Ashby, the owner of the farm, and they sign the guest book. From what I can tell, there are 2 distinct levels of experience in the group. Glenn, Stephen, and Christine Millett, who operate a family-owned dive centre in Sydney, and Robert Smith, who's the president of the dive club, are all members of FAUI, or the Federation of Australian Underwater Instructors. I'm not sure if that means the 4 of them are instructors, but it looks like they have more experience than the second group of 5 divers. Peter Burr, Larry Reynolds, Gordon Roberts, John Bockerman, and Joan Harper seem to be recreational divers. From what I can see, the divers regard themselves as experienced, but I don't know how many dives they've done or what their qualifications actually are. In the 1960s and 70s, training and qualifications weren't as structured as they are today. Training was more or less passed on from one diver to another. Christine Millett, the youngest in the group at 19, is making a name for herself as a diving prodigy. She was featured on the cover page of Skin Diving magazine when she was 18. Robert Smith, the club's president, is the only one to have dived in the Shaft. He's been to Mount Gambier 8 times, racking up 25 dives in the shaft. The last time was a year earlier over Easter weekend in 1972. The rest of the group have most likely trained and dived in the ocean. I get the sense that this is an exciting time to be involved in scuba diving. This young group are pioneers in the sport at a time when scuba diving is starting to become popular. After setting up their equipment, the group makes their first dive. They lay out a shot line all the way to the rock pile at 40 meters. A shot line is a cord or a rope with a buoy as a floater tied to one end. The other end is weighted or tied to an object at the bottom and used as a guideline for descending and ascending. After setting their guideline, the divers explore the rock pile to familiarize themselves with their surroundings. Then they descend to a depth of 55 meters towards the edge of the northwest tunnel. No one before them has dived beyond this point. Looking over the edge of this drop-off, you have to imagine the conflict in your mind. On one hand, there's an immense draw to descend into the cave to explore where no one has been before. And on the other, your heart is racing at the idea of going deeper into the black water with no direct access to the surface. The group turns around and heads back up the shot line to prepare for their second dive the next morning. On the morning of the 28th of May, the divers prepare their equipment at the caravan park. They double-check their tanks are full after refilling them the day before. They replace the batteries in their torches with new ones. They make last-minute checks to their regulators, inflatable vests, wetsuits, and masks. Christine goes to the kiosk to get a coffee and strikes up a conversation with the caretaker. She says,
"We're going down the shaft to 76 meters. It'll be a bounce job, straight down and straight up."
Bounce diving to 76 meters, they can stay 1 or 2 minutes and they have to come straight back up. That depth isn't even on recreational diving tables, which divers use to plan how long they can stay at a specific depth. They could go past the 66 meter limit and still avoid oxygen toxicity, but again, only for a short period of time. The deeper they go, the more quickly they consume the air in their tank. And past 30 meters, they'll also start to experience nitrogen narcosis, which is like drinking martinis underwater. The deeper they go, the stronger the effect. But it wears off as soon as they start to come back up. Their entire plan revolves around getting in and out really quickly without anything going wrong. The caretaker warns Christine to rethink their plan. He's seen enough experienced divers meet their end in the sinkholes. But Christine just brushes him off, saying, "We're all diving instructors." Now, the way I understand it, there's a general plan to explore the outer fringes of the main chamber, staying inside the natural light from the shaft. But Christine and some of the other more experienced divers have a different plan. When they reach the edge of the perimeter, they plan to descend to 76 meters to set a record, then head back to the surface. But there isn't a member of the group designated as the leader with responsibility for coordinating the dive. I'm not sure if the two groups have talked to each other about the plan or if it's a secret plan. And I can't quite make out who's involved in the secret plan. If Christine is saying it's the diving instructors, then it's quite likely the siblings who run the dive shop, Christine, Glenn, and Stephen Millett, along with the club president, Robert Smith. The group drives out to the sinkhole for their exploratory dive. Joan, the 9th member of the group, decides to skip the dive. She had problems on the ladder into the cave the day before. She decides to stay outside the sinkhole, make some food, and help the other divers. As the group climbs through the narrow entryway, clouds begin to form over the horizon. The 8 divers enter the water at 1300 and descend quickly. The group don't split up into buddy pairs. Instead, they descend as one group. They don't leave a spare emergency tank on the shot line for decompression. They don't have a cave reel to use as a safety line to follow on their way down or back out. They reason that because there's 8 divers, the lines will just get in the way and it's not practical use on a rocky bottom. They reach the top of the rock pile at a depth of 36 meters, which is the shallowest point in the cave. The group gathers at the top of the rock pile and check each other by exchanging the OK signal. Robert Smith, the club's president, takes the lead and heads down to the boulder-covered floor where they finished their dive the previous day. He takes them to the edge, 24 meters from the rock pile. Just before they reach the drop-off at a depth of 55 meters, Robert begins to feel lightheaded. He recognizes the effect of nitrogen narcosis. Robert checks his depth gauge and turns to the others following close behind and signals that he's dizzy and is turning back to the top of the rock pile. They signal okay, and 7 divers continue their descent while Robert swims back alone. By the time he gets to the top of the rock pile, the effects of nitrogen narcosis wear off and he feels much better. While he waits for the group to come back, he passes the time looking for old animal bones and skeletons. Robert Smith is possibly one of the diving instructors that was planning to bounce dive to 76 meters. Now that leaves Christine, Glenn, and Stephen Millett, the dive shop siblings. The group continue their dive down the slope on one side of the perimeter of the main chamber. The water is clear and light from the shaft above lights their way. Stephen Millett from the dive shop and Peter Burr take photos as they go. By the time the 7 divers reach the edge at around 60 meters, the natural light from the entrance of the sinkhole is gone. It's dark, uncharted territory covered in loose silt and limestone rubble. They swim over the drop-off and follow the contour that slopes down at a steep angle. As they disappear into the abyss, Peter Burr, the last person in the group, follows cautiously. He follows for about 15 meters but starts to feel groggy, the effects of nitrogen narcosis sinking in. He goes to the nearest diver, Glenn Millett, to check his depth gauge. From the information I can find, it's not clear if Peter has his own depth gauge, but it looks like he doesn't, and so he's relying on Glenn's equipment. Glenn looks at the depth, then checks his own air supply and realizes he's already short on air. Everyone has the same amount of air, so he figures they must all be short on air. He decides they've all gone far enough and it's time to head back, so he reaches for his sister Christine to signal her to turn around and head back to the surface. But he can't catch her attention. Glenn Millett is one of the dive shop siblings, but it seems like he's not one of the instructors that Christine talked about bounce diving to 76 meters. Glenn knows they need to turn around. The other 2 dive shop siblings, Christine and Stephen Millett, are heading down to a depth they shouldn't be, with no cave reel. They're low on air and inadvertently leading 3 less experienced divers down with them, who don't have the equipment or experience to recognize that this isn't part of the dive plan. As Glenn swims down to try and catch his sister, Peter Burr, who's at the back of the group, doesn't get a look at Glenn's depth gauge, which reads 65 meters. Peter sees Glenn continue down into the cave, and so he decides to keep going, despite feeling the effects of nitrogen narcosis. His senses become dull, his body becomes heavy, and he struggles to keep up with the group. He tries to focus instead on the beam of light from his torch. He doesn't notice Glenn turning back. Glenn is running short on air and turns around while the rest of the group continue deeper into the cave. He ascends to go to a shallower depth to wait for them. 6 divers continue. John Bockerman, one of the recreational divers, now takes the lead and swims strongly down into the cave. He's probably affected by nitrogen narcosis, which impairs his judgment. Or he just wants to reach their goal of 76 meters first. But I'm not even sure he was part of the bounce dive plan to begin with. The problem with nitrogen narcosis is that it's like being drunk, and we all know people who develop a certain invincibility after a few beers. John is followed by Christine Millett from the dive shop, then Gordon Roberts, Larry Reynolds, and Peter Burr trailing from behind. It's not clear from the accounts if Stephen Millett is still with the pack. When they reach 68 meters, Gordon signals for Larry to check his depth gauge and his air. Both men realize they are low on air. They check Christine's air, and although she has more than them, Gordon gives the signal to ascend, and so the 3 begin to ascend rapidly. The group of 6 divers is now split. Christine Millett from the dive shop ascends with recreational divers Gordon and Larry. Peter Burr glances up and sees them heading back, but John Bockerman isn't looking, and Stephen Millett is unaccounted for. Because their air is low, Gordon, Christine, and Larry ascend rapidly to the surface, almost straight up, instead of retracing their steps back along the contour of the cave sloping upwards. The mass of clouds forming over the horizon when they started their dive is now over Thompson's paddock, blocking the shaft of light into the water. The rock pile that should be their orientation is no longer visible. With the cave in darkness, the divers can't see anything but the beam of light from their torches, which doesn't shine far in the silt they've already stirred up on their way down into the cave. Without a safety line, they make their way up in zero visibility. The effects of nitrogen narcosis further heightens their sense of fear, panic, and confusion. At 45 meters, Gordon and Christine enter a dome-like hole in the ceiling of the cave. Larry, who's behind about 3 meters below the two divers, sees them sweeping their torches looking for a way out. Gordon signals that they're lost. From the reflection in their torchlights, Larry can see that Gordon and Christine look scared. He's hit with an overwhelming sense of panic when his torch goes out. He panics while he struggles to turn it on again, and while he's focused on his torch, he loses buoyancy and starts to descend back into the cave. He struggles with his torch, and it flickers back to life. Deeper in the water, he sees the silhouette of another diver near the floor. He doesn't recognize that it's Peter Burr, but swims quickly in his direction. Then he catches a glimmer of the faint, diffused light from the opening of the sinkhole and turns to swim towards the light. He finds Glenn and Robert heading to the surface and joins them. Peter sees Gordon and Christine in the dome at the ceiling of the cave, and Larry right behind them, but silt fills the water and obscures his vision. Then he sees a light up ahead and the other divers, Glenn and Robert. As he swims in their direction, his breathing tightens as his tank runs low on air. He pulls the reserve rod to release the remaining air in his cylinder, a feature of older equipment that no longer exists. Then he looks at his decompression meter, which is a precursor to modern dive computers, and sees that he's exceeded his limits by a few minutes. He ascends to 3 meters below the waterline to do a decompression stop until his reserve air runs out. Robert has been looking for old animal bones and skeletons at the bottom of the rock pile for about 8 minutes while he waits for the group. He ascends to the top of the rock pile and sees Glenn returning from the cave. Glenn's been watching his air while he waits for the group at the ledge, but now he's running out of air and ascends to the surface. He follows the glimmer of light from the sinkhole. Robert sees Glenn swimming steadily for the surface and follows him, thinking Glenn must be the last diver to ascend. They both reach the surface, followed by Larry, and about 30 seconds later, Peter reaches his 3-meter mark. They realize 4 divers are still underwater. Glenn asks Joan, who's above ground, to lower a spare cylinder and regulator. He immediately dives down to find his brother and sister and the other 2 missing divers. He goes down the shot line, then out and down to a depth of 45 meters. There's no sign of the missing divers. He almost ran out of air on his first dive, and he didn't go as deep as the other divers. A tightening in the pit of his stomach tells him they've already run out of air. Glenn returns to the surface and tells the others. Now Robert replaces his tank and dives to where he last saw the group at 55 meters. He finds no trace of the divers. He goes further down to 60 meters towards the edge where he finds Stephen Millet's torch and camera. As he goes deeper, the visibility deteriorates because of the silt. He gets to 68 meters, which is where Larry told him they ended their dive. The visibility is so bad, Robert can't see his hand in front of him. He turns around and ascends to where the visibility is better and he can see the rock pile. After 10 minutes, he ends his search and ascends, stopping for decompression before surfacing. Peter borrows Robert's gear and he goes down for one last fruitless search. There is nothing else they can do, so they ask Joan to notify the authorities. Joan runs to the homestead of B.V. Ashby, the owner of the farm, to report the accident and to call for help. Ashby calls the Mount Gambier police station, who send a rescue team and an ambulance to the sinkhole. On the 29th of May, the police underwater recovery squad arrives at the shaft and immediately conducts a search dive to 60 meters. They don't find any bodies, but they do find several items of equipment from the group. They make several dives over a number of days, but they don't find the missing divers. They're working on a vague description of the sinkhole from the survivors, but it's never been mapped. A Royal Australian Navy diving team offered to assist the police. After meeting with the police divers, the Navy realized the police underwater recovery squad is not trained nor properly equipped to dive below 30 meters. They agree that the recovery squad needs to train to dive to 55 meters first and upgrade their equipment before the recovery can continue. The recovery operation is suspended and no civilian diving is allowed at the shaft until further notice. On the 22nd of January 1974, 8 months after the incident, a TV film crew making a documentary on cave diving descend to a depth of 15 meters. Using professional lighting equipment, they illuminate the cave to start filming. A crew member notices an extra diver on the sloping roof of the cave behind 2 of his teammates. He swims closer to see who it is and finds the body of a diver stuck under a small ledge. They surface and contact the authorities. The next day, the police recovery squad retrieved the body of Stephen Millett, one of the dive shop's siblings. B.V. Ashby, the landowner, doesn't like the idea of having 3 bodies stuck in a cave on his property. He approaches an experienced cave diving team from Melbourne to help the recovery efforts. On the 9th of March 1974, the diving team finds a body lying on its back at a depth of 59 meters, and a second body slightly deeper, Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts. Further down at 66 meters, they find John Bockerman underneath a rock ledge. They notify the police recovery squad, who retrieve the bodies of Christine and Gordon 2 days later on the 11th of March. Because John's body is much deeper, nitrogen narcosis hampers their effort. The police divers pause their operation for a month to formulate a plan and train for the body recovery at 66 meters. On the 9th of April 1974, 11 months after the accident, the police recovery squad returned to the shaft and retrieved John's body. A coroner's inquest was conducted and found that the victims had inadequate air supply for the depth of their dive and drowned when they ran out of air. Not one from the group who died was an experienced sinkhole diver, and no proper safety precautions were taken. The shaft, along with 3 other sinkholes, claimed 11 lives in a series of incidents from 1969 to 1974. The public attention forced a government inquiry on the safety of scuba diving in sinkholes, which led to the formation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia in September 1973. Diving in sinkholes became restricted to divers assessed or accredited by the Cave Diving Association of Australia, which led to a decline in accidents and fatalities in sinkhole diving. In 1989, the assessment was replaced by a training program with 3 levels of qualification: cave, advanced cave, and deep cavern. The shaft's main cavern was mapped in 1984 by the newly formed Cave Divers Association of Australia Research Group. The deepest sections were surveyed and mapped in 2003. The northwest tunnel slopes to a depth of 80 meters where the 4 divers died, and the east tunnel reaches a maximum depth of 124 meters.